A BBC investigation has found that a shadow industry of law firms and advisors is charging thousands of pounds to help migrants pretend to be gay in order to stay in the UK under the UK's asylum system. And one of the journalists who's been working on this, because it's been a team effort, is Billy Kenber, and he's here. Hello, Billy.
Hello.
And we should give some credit to Phil Kemp, your colleague, who's also been working on this.
Absolutely.
Now, this is a very different kind of journalism from what I've ever done in my career. So I'm selfishly intrigued to just work out how you even go about starting an investigation like this. And we'll go into the details of the story in a second, but just tell us a bit of your process.
So we started with the fact that asylum claims were at record levels, it topped 100,000, and that there had been a lot of focus on small boats, on people arriving illegally in the country, and on the government's behalf trying to stop the smugglers facilitating that passage, but much less focus on another big cohort of those asylum claims, which is people that had come to the country legally on visas, on work visas or student visas or as tourists, and then had entered a claim for asylum. And we had some initial information that there was a particular issue with that group of fake claims being made, and that they were being facilitated by advisors not overseas like the criminal gangs behind the small boats, but here in the UK. So that's where we started from. We, at that point, really, as with any other story of this kind, set out to find out more, to speak to people, to gather information, look at documents, see what we could learn. And as we did that, the more research we did, we realised that the only way to really penetrate this story, to penetrate this hidden world, was to go undercover.
Yeah, so you got an undercover reporter, and where did he end up? Just explain how he ended up in someone's bedroom.
Yes, so we actually used...
Because that's the sort of the denouement of this, isn't it?
We worked with two very good undercover reporters on this story, and one of them did indeed end up in the bedroom of one of the legal advisors. So that begins with a phone call that he made to a paralegal, someone at a law firm in London. That person said quite straightforwardly, you need to be persecuted to claim asylum. But they were willing to meet. But before that meeting ever took place, and it never did take place, he received a call just out of the blue while we were filming something else to do with this story, and that was from a woman called Tanisha, and that's the woman whose bedroom he ended up in later that same day. We went out to. He arranged to meet her. That turned out to be at her house in Forest Gate in East London. And when he was invited inside, she led him up the stairs and into her bedroom for a consultation.
So she basically was using her bedroom kind of like her office. And then what did she advise him to do in this consultation?
So she described how she could offer a comprehensive package to facilitate a fake claim, that he should pretend to be gay. He's from Pakistan. Homosexual acts are illegal in Pakistan, so you can legitimately claim asylum from with that background if you were genuinely gay. And she explained all of the evidence that she would help assemble to do that he would need to go to gay clubs, for example, and take photographs, get receipts of drinks from all this sort of proof of that sort of thing, go to LGBT groups and attend events, buy tickets. She said that she would be able to provide someone who could pretend that they'd been his partner and that they'd write a letter saying that they'd had a sexual relationship with this person, so he could present that to the Home Office. There's a huge array of evidence that gets assembled in these sorts of cases. And she said that that's what would happen initially. He'd make the claim, he'd submit this evidence, and that when it was time for his interview with the Home Office to try and assess his credibility, she would coach him. She'd train him on what to say. She'd show him questions that were asked to other migrants recently in a similar situation, and she'd help him through it. She said, you need to do some work too. I'll be like the teacher, but is it on the teacher if you fail the exam? It's not going to just be all on me.
And what's so interesting here, Billy, is that we're so often, aren't we, in our reporting around asylum, we look at the visible elements, and I guess the most politically visible elements in the last couple of years have been small boat crossings. And what you've got to, and Phil has got to in this investigation, is showing our newscasters and others an insight into something that frankly normally is invisible, but is a massive contributor towards this whole issue.
And we really got, I think, more than perhaps we'd anticipated, a sense of the infrastructure and how this worked in a sort of systematic way. So this advisor, Tanisha, was affiliated with one of these community groups, with an LGBT asylum seekers group. And as it went on, in a subsequent meeting with her, with our undercover reporter, he became a client, and she said, you need to come along to this group's meetings. Actually, we have one next week. So he went along to one of those meetings. It was in Bessent in East London. and there must have been 175, 200 people there for this meeting and in this hall and on a Tuesday evening in Beckton, and many of the people there, she said, were like him. They weren't genuinely gay. They were just pretending. So this was part of that ecosystem designed to facilitate fake claims, or was certainly being used in that respect.
And you actually got one of the guys who's in that meeting who's standing outside, and he says not even 1% of the people in that room are gay, not even 0.1% of them are gay. So basically revealing that lots of the people in that room knew what they were doing.
Yeah, exactly. We can't be sure, and it's quite possible that there were some genuine applicants there, but certainly...
Just like there are in the whole system.
Absolutely. And the whole system, is there to offer protection to people that are in fairly desperate situations. It's not safe for them to live in their home country. That is what asylum is there to provide. So there's it's a really serious purpose, and the serious consequences of these fake claims that they make it harder for people with genuine claims to be able to obtain asylum.
That's the thing, isn't it? Because if you're going to have an asylum system that acknowledges, I mean, right at the heart of the asylum system is the reality that for some people a return to their homeland would be dangerous, and in some instances, like sexuality, your sexuality could be the very reason it's dangerous. Creating a system that allows the collation of evidence for people to make a case, when the nature of a lot of that evidence is going to be at least potentially circumstantial or not definitive. How you then create a system that has it is recognised to be fair and scrupulous, that can't be exploited, but at the same time allows people genuinely with that concern to be able to be granted asylum. That is really hard.
Well, and Billy, on that issue of evidence, you spoke to other people who explained some of the lengths they'd gone to provide that evidence for their claims.
We did. So we spoke in particular, for example, to a man who was back in Pakistan who'd made an application a few years ago pretending to be gay along with several of his friends. They all used the same solicitor in London. His friends were successful. He wasn't. He ended up spending a lot of money on appeals and ultimately gave up. But as part of that process, he talked about how he was coached in what to do, and one of the things he did was to pretend to be someone living with HIV and to tell a community group that was his status.
And also there's a family element to this as well. We often talk about how the immigration system allows people to bring family members in from abroad when they're here. There's an element of that in this story too.
Yeah, so the undercover reporter who met with Tanisha during that conversation, just to really to really test, I suppose, the limits of what sort of service she was offering and what solution she would suggest, told her that he had a wife, that he was married in Pakistan, that the authorities here didn't know, but he was in a relationship with a woman in Pakistan who he would like to bring over to the UK, and she said, "No problem, you bring her over as a tourist or whatever, and once she's here, I'll make her a lesbian, i.e., I'll get her to make a claim on the same basis of yours as, for asylum and succeed." And the man we spoke to who'd moved back to Pakistan because his claim failed said that friends who had succeeded brought their wives, their children over after that had happened, and that there were no checks from the Home Office. You've claimed asylum, you've obtained asylum on the basis that you're gay, and now you're bringing your wife over from Pakistan.
I suppose the very nature of this, Billy, means we don't know how many people have successfully use this technique, these methods, in order to be granted asylum.
No, we don't. It's that's the truth of it. There are some figures that give us an idea of the scale of this sort of problem, but even those are limited. So the Home Office publishes figures for the number of asylum claims on the basis of sexual orientation. They fluctuate between about 1,500 and 2,000 over the last few years, but we don't have any figures since 2023, and the number of asylum claims has been increasing dramatically. So we don't know how many of those types of claims there are. We don't know, obviously, within that just how many are fake. And pretending to be gay is not the only route people are using to fake asylum claims. We heard too about people pretending to be atheists, pretending to be political activists, and again building up fabricated evidence in order to do that.
And it was interesting listening to Peter Tatchell on Radio 4, a veteran gay rights campaigner, talking to Sarah Montague about this, because he said, yeah, on the one hand, one of the things he's experienced with the asylum system is lots of people making claims that they're going to be tortured or harmed if they go back home for being gay. That claim is turned down, but actually huge numbers of people then get it approved on appeal. So he says that's happening on the one hand. But then on the other hand, he was saying his organisation has stopped advertising certain events because he was getting mobbed by men who he thought were clearly straight, but who wanted to appear gay and wanted a selfie with him as part of their case. So that's the kind of the two sides of the coin there, just from Peter Tatchell.
Right.
And I heard today from someone who runs another LGBT group, a genuine group, saying they had to ban people taking photographs because just people turning up, taking photographs, immediately leaving, not even staying for the event. And again, they appeared to them to be just doing that for an asylum claim.
One thing I'm often intrigued by, Billy, with the kind of investigative journalism that you do is the reactions it prompts from those who are sort of broadly, if you like, involved or connected with some of the themes you're exploring. Has that been happening today? Your sort of email pinging away or whatever, with people reading or seeing or hearing about it and thinking, oh, hang on a minute, I've got a line into this.
Absolutely, and there's actually a part 2 to this investigation that's coming tomorrow, and we've had several emails today from people saying the next thing you should be looking at is this, and that is actually what we're going to be looking at in tomorrow's story. So certainly a lot of people getting in touch with different aspects of the immigration system that they think we should take a look at.
And just in terms of how people involved in this have responded, so Tanisha, the woman that I refer to sitting on the edge of her bed, giving this advice as a consultant, she said, oh, this conversation was happening in Urdu and she doesn't speak Urdu very well, so she wasn't exactly sure what she was saying. That's
what she said, exactly. So Worcester LGBT, the group that organised the community event, they said they don't create, encourage or support fabricated evidence in asylum claims, and they said that they are in fact investigating Tanisha and that she had no decision-making authority within the organisation. So the lawyer that we initially rang, who passed the undercover reporter's number to Tanisha, he said that he had no knowledge when he did that she'd offered to fabricate an asylum claim, and that had he suspected anything of that nature, he wouldn't have made the referral and he'd have reported the matter immediately. And the law firm where Tanisha had a meeting with our undercover reporter in her bedroom initially, but subsequently the 2 further meetings were in the offices of a law firm in East London, and that law firm said they had no professional connection with her, that the reporter was never set up as a client of the firm, and that they're investigating potentially unauthorised access to their office.
And it's worth Adam reflecting on the political reaction, which there has been.
That's what I was going to do next. The kind of journalism I actually normally do, as opposed to Billy's amazing investigative journalism.
I'll save you a question.
Yeah.
And I think, Billy, what's interesting with the political reaction is that the kind of vocabulary that political parties, from the government to the opposition parties, are using is all pretty similar, isn't it? People saying it's deplorable, it's abhorrent, and clearly seeing the evidence that Billy and Phil have broadcast and saying, blimey, this is bad. But the big question, it seems to me, Adam and Billy, on this is that I was just looking back at a YouGov tracker poll about asylum and immigration going back to 2011. So in that time, obviously, we've had all of the Brexit arguments where immigration in the round was a big theme, but also governments at Westminster involving the Conservatives, the Liberal Democrats and Labour. And that stickiness, that persistence of the salience of immigration and asylum, yes, it's ebbed and flowed, but broadly speaking, it's been in the top 3, sometimes, broadly speaking, around there, alongside health and the economy in terms of the concerns that people have about the country. In other words, underlying that, I think a persistence of a sense from people that governments of multiple colours have not got a grip on this, and particularly around control of it and a sense of fairness. And that's why this investigation is so significant, because it plays absolutely into that, I think.
And this advisor, Tanisha, who we've been talking about, she's one of a number of advisors that we met during the undercover investigation, but she said that she's been doing this work for at least 17 years.
Right.
And just to be explicit about what the political parties have been saying, the Conservatives said that this exposes the scam at the heart of many asylum claims. The Liberal Democrats said that these findings were abhorrent. Reform said that this is an outrageous scandal that must be urgently investigated. The Greens said it's disgusting to see these unscrupulous law firms taking advantage of people or taking advantage of a system like this. And Chris, what Shabana Mahmood's responded to this as the Home Secretary?
Yeah, so she said it's deplorable. Downing Street have said those trying to defraud the British people should have their asylum, or will have their asylum claim, cancelled, and said unethical and illegal practices should be referred to the appropriate regulatory bodies or the police. And I think, Billy, there was a bit more of a statement, was there, from Shabana Mahmood? Is that right? What else did she have to say? I got a bit of a sense from Downing Street. Deplorable tended to be the sort of adjective of choice.
Yeah, it was
in government.
Very much just condemning this behaviour and emphasising that the hard line that the government intends to take on those caught doing it.
What I didn't quite understand about how the system works is, okay, so the system at the moment is person makes a claim, that claim might be rejected, or it might be approved, or they might be rejected and then approved on appeal, or they might just get sent out of the country because it's just failed full stop. Is there a way for then going back to someone's claim to check whether they might have been fraudulent while they were making it? To me, it seems that the decision's made, the person stays, and then the system sort of forgets about them.
Well, it's a great question.
Because we might not know the answer. If you don't know the answer, don't worry about it. We'll not go there.
No, I don't know.
Because I just think that
one of the changes that has come in is this this change where you don't get it granted for 5 years, you get it granted for 2.5 years, and then it gets checked and renewed, and after 5 years you can apply for indefinite leave to remain, and that period is going to extend, or the indications are that period will extend. And so there is then potentially a check at the 2.5 year mark, but if you've managed to deceive the Home Office during that very extensive initial application process, or potentially after rounds of appeal in the courts, what is going to happen at the point where these checks are being made that is suddenly going to mean you're rumbled? And certainly, for what it's worth, Tanisha was not concerned that those changes were going to make any difference to her business from what we could tell of her interactions with our reporter.
And also, short of moments like this where particular things are exposed, how would the system why would the system become suspicious of someone who it had previously not been suspicious of?
That's what I mean. That there doesn't seem to be a sort of retrospective element to this, even though lots of people today are saying, "Oh, we'll pursue the people that did it fraudulently."
But then if you're. But how do you?
Yeah.
You know,
although I do know a sort of simpler solution that some people have come up with today is that you just say no more visas for study for people from Pakistan. Because if it's people who come here on a student visa from Pakistan, and then there's a suspicion that they're then gaming the asylum system using these methods, then the way you prevent that is by stopping Pakistani students coming to study in the UK, which there's a precedent for because we've already done that with some other countries this year.
And then you start to wonder about, is there a way that they could raise the bar on what the evidence would be that would be presented, whether it's proving that you're gay or whatever it might be. But that
has to be done in a way that then doesn't provoke accusations of homophobia being injected into the asylum system.
Yes, and also where the evidence case for lots of these things, whether it is sexuality or being atheist or whatever it might be, is not likely to be clear cut. There isn't likely to be a single definitive clear cut bit of evidence that would prove that beyond any doubt.
And that's what goes to the heart of this. As Tanisha put it, there's no machine that can tell if you're gay. It's ultimately going to be a credibility test. The sorts of evidence that they are creating to facilitate the fake claims are the sorts of evidence that's worked in the last few years. Maybe the types of evidence the Home Office looks for will change, but why wouldn't the advisors bringing the fraudulent claim just change the types of evidence they're willing to create? It's just going to be a sort of whack-a-mole scenario. So it's definitely a very... It's a very tricky one for the Home Office to root out these cases, particularly when there's so much effort going into making them. I think that's the thing that's really telling from what we've found is that just how sophisticated it is.
Billy, thanks for all your hard investigative journalism, and good luck staying up late, working on part 2 and fending requests for part 3, 4, 5 and 6.
Thank you.
And Chris, good to see you too.
Ta.
Now, earlier on when I was in the other Newscast studio, I caught up with Faisal Islam, who was in Washington, D.C. for that big regular meeting of finance ministers where they talk about all the issues in the global economy and they talk about those projections for the global economy by organisations like the International Monetary Fund. So here is Faisal's take as he was running from building to building and finance minister to finance minister. Hello, Faisal.
Hi.
Where are you right now? Paint a picture of your surroundings, please.
I'm in the lobby of the World Bank, which is of the institution that deals with poverty, crisis, alleviation, loans, that sort of stuff. And it is the biannual meetings of finance ministers and development ministers here. And so that's what's going on. And there's a lot of activity, obviously, around the ordinary workings of the kind of economic firefighters trying to save the world in a crisis, emergency loans and things like that. but also just kind of standard meetings of G7 and G20 finance ministers trying to deal with what I have to say is just yet another geopolitical crisis. Sort of every time you sort of think that the normality has resumed, it kind of some crisis kind of intrudes upon you, and that's obviously the case right now.
And where is this current crisis on the crisisometer, as it were? Because you've been at these meetings when so many things have popped up in the world.
Yeah. I can go back to obviously the great financial crisis in 2008, the Eurozone crisis when they thought the euro was going to fall apart, the mini budget crisis in 2022. I mean, this one, there's two separate ways of measuring it. It has the potential to be like the 1970s oil shock, kind of before we were born, but like significant major global event. It's sort of getting there, but it kind of just depends how long it lasts. Which is an unsatisfactory answer, but the sheer quantity of oil and gas that's shut into the Gulf is one thing. But then you have all the other derivative products, and I've just come from a press briefing with the managing director of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, and her point was that all these derivative products that normally in a functioning world economy nobody cares about, the things that go into making plastics, fertilizers, the helium required to make a semiconductor chip, all of this stuff, it just functions, it works, it spreads around the world economy kind of naturally according to the market. All of that is greatly affected in ways that probably, even myself as economics editor didn't fully kind of comprehend just how much having 800 ships locked into the Gulf would have this cascading effect. And the critical moment right now is that all of those ships, had they been set free in the Straits of Hormuz, would have reached their destination around now. So the physical shortages, particularly in Asia, you'll start to see now.
And Faisal, don't worry, we had quite a long discussion on the previous episode of Newscast about why it's okay to admit you don't know what's going to happen. I don't mean you, why one in particular can say that they don't know what's going to happen, because that's the theme in all sorts of institutions at the moment. Right, talk about this beef between Rachel Reeves and the US administration.
Yes, very interesting, I think, the strength of words. And we've heard versions of this sort of brewing over the past 2 or 3 weeks. We've heard, some obvious. It's not just criticism of the decision to go to war with Iran in an unplanned fashion, but almost this government sort of trading on that quite fundamentally and sort of defining themselves and Keir Starmer in that way. And so she sort of upped the ante on that with an interview in the Mirror just before she arrived here in Washington, saying that the war was folly, saying that she's frustrated and that she's angry as well. And then after that, she has now kind of amassed a dozen or so other finance ministers to sort of sign up to a call for a ceasefire based on not just the humanitarian damage, but the damage to the world economy too. And I spoke yesterday with the US Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, who, when I put to him what he thought about the forecasts from the IMF of a potential global recession if this continues for months, the message we're getting from the US administration is, well, this is all going to be over quite soon. Everyone can calm down, everyone's panicking. But in general, he said something quite kind of like, I was like, ooh, when he said this, he said, well, what would the GDP hit be if with a nuclear strike on London? And I just stood up in myself, like, okay.
In other words, if the Iranian regime had been allowed to continue its pursuit of a nuclear weapon, they could have, in theory, threatened London. And so therefore, the US taking out that threat was a bigger help to the economy than the cost to the economy that we're experiencing now.
Indeed, but rather bluntly put, and I had to ask him what he actually meant by, clarify what he meant by that. And another form of words that I think is quite interesting in terms of understanding the US mentality here is that they think and they say, and they're clearly under a lot of pressure here. The whole world's finance ministries have turned up to, today in Washington and are sequentially meeting with the US administration saying, what on earth is going on? In an echo of exactly what happened a year ago on tariffs. And he said, well, a small amount of economic pain for a few weeks is worth it to take out this threat to global security. That's the general argument we're hearing. We're hearing that argument, and we're also hearing don't worry, it's going to be over in weeks. That's the two prongs of the argument that we're hearing. But you're absolutely right to say that there's that spat. We also heard from enterprising colleagues on Sky News about this call with Donald Trump, where he floated, murmured out aloud about the idea that the UK had a very good sweetheart tariff deal with him last year, and that could be revisited based on the UK's lack of loyalty. There's a lot of sort of UK-centric views of this. He's obviously sort of lashing out at different entities right now. We're not alone here. Italy, very much the sort of apple of Donald Trump's eye. Giorgia Meloni also coming in for some criticism in that spat over the role of the Pope, Pope Leo, obviously from Chicago originally. So it's quite difficult to fathom really where this all goes, but clearly the economic angle here is central to the conflict. And as the French finance minister put it to me last night, this is, the Iranians are well aware of the economic consequences. This is part of their battle.
I'm just interested about how the feeling of multilateral organizations, because that's what the World Bank and the IMF are, organizations where lots of countries are members and they come together to work together. How does that whole multilateral system feel when you've got a US administration kind of just doing whatever it wants and not behaving in a very multilateral way, being quite unilateral?
Yes, well, here's what's really quite interesting is that you're hearing a rhetoric from the top of these organizations now, which is very much seems as if it's trying to keep the Trump administration at bay in a way, to try and sort of speak their language to some degree, sort of get them off their back. When Donald Trump came into office, there was Project 2030, was it, or 2050?
Project 2025.
There was a sort of blueprint.
Yeah, from the Heritage Foundation, the think tank. Yeah,
that's it. Project 2025. I forgot the precise numbers, but yeah, Project 2025. And the theory was, that they might have abolished the IMF and the World Bank, but they've kept it going. I was very struck by the sorts of rhetoric you're hearing from the head of the World Bank. They're very much now. They were reinventing themselves as, for example, climate change banks 2 or 3 years ago under Joe Biden, and now it's very difficult to hear them say the phrase climate change. You are seeing a sort of an attempt that you see echoed in individual nation states to just try and sort of manage the new reality. But they are still here. They haven't been abolished. They do have an important role. I told you I was just at this briefing with the managing director of the IMF, and there is a big demand from African countries now, because debts are so high, because interest rates are going up, because demands as energy bills go up are intense. Big demand from African countries for help and for support. She said something very interesting, which is because of the physical shortages of some of the things I mentioned that are now inevitable, even if a ceasefire happens tomorrow, that countries should now start planning to economize on energy. And even think about working from home, free public transport to prevent use of overuse of fuels. I think that was mainly aimed at developing countries, but I think that there's an interesting question about the extent to which some of this stuff might be required elsewhere, shall we say.
Well, yeah, it's already happening in Australia, isn't it? But then they are sort of uniquely placed geographically to suffer from this situation. Faisal, last question for you. Does the UK seem like an outlier at this meeting, like where we've got our own particular problems that might make us particularly vulnerable, which was the sort of feeling from the IMF's assessment of global growth this year and next year? Or actually, from what you're saying, every country has problems. They're just sort of maybe different problems and different combinations.
Yeah, we can get a bit sort of obsessed with the UK being at the eye of every storm. But I think the reality is when you look around the world and you see that there are countries whose refineries will be running out of feedstocks that make their plastics and semiconductors, which is their key export, and their oil and gas, and that could happen fairly imminently. One needs to get this in perspective. And there are countries in the Middle East, obviously, whose petrochemical industries have faced missile attacks. One needs to get this in a bit of perspective. Even the figures that came out from the IMF, yes, they did tell a story of the UK being hit and having sluggish and very disappointing growth just when we thought it was safe to sort of creep out into the world and think maybe normal growth was coming back again. but it still leaves Britain sort of middle of the pack. In fact, actually, I think over 2 years, the fastest G7 European economy. It's not like the most amazing claim in the world, and it's basically pretty sluggish, but it's not like I think occasionally we've had this conversation before. We can overstate the centrality of the UK to every global story, and I think that there is a sort of convening role that the Chancellor and the Prime Minister are kind of mapping out in terms of trying, once a peace deal is done, to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, using our shipping expertise, using the fact that the insurance companies are based in the UK. I don't want to overstate that, but I think probably, given what happened in the economic outlook and that downgrade, that perhaps overstates it the other way. Yes, we're going to be hit. Yes, we're over dependent on imported energy. That does mean a price has to be paid. There's still a hangover from the political chaos in the bond markets, and our interest rates in markets go up faster and come down faster. There's more volatility than you would like. The government hasn't nailed that issue in the markets, but it can be overstated too.
And Faisal, I know you've got to dash off to something else, but just in terms of process, we'll see Rachel Reeves and her opposite number, Scott Bessent, actually in person meeting each other rather than just trading barbs indirectly quite soon.
How much of this we will see, I'm not entirely sure of. I think we might see a photo of it, and I look forward to the readouts,
the versions.
Occasionally the different versions. And I recall from last year that the readout came about 3 days later from the Americans. But I do have some contacts in the administration. I don't have Donald Trump's phone number, unfortunately, or fortunately for him, but we may be able to get a sense of what's going on a little bit earlier.
I'm sure Donald Trump would find it a stimulating conversation, as I have just done. Faisal, thank you very much, and safe travels.
Thanks, Adam. Bye.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast. Thank you very much for listening. And a reminder that after the Easter break, we will be back on BBC One with a TV episode of Newscast after Question Time on Thursday, if you want to stay up late. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.